Hi everybody, I'm back with another video, this time about Rebecca Leydon's article. It is called Clean as a Whistle, Timbral Trajectories and the Modern Musical Sublime. So I'm going to give an overview of that and go through what I put on my handout. So this is the front of the beginning of the article, and this is another one from the Music Theory Online open access journal that I love assigning things from because you can access it so easily. And you can see that this article eventually focuses on Black angels, and that's partly why I assigned it. It's an article that I cite in my work about Black angels, and it's one on timbre, and I assigned it partially because I just want to get to know it better. So here's my handout. You can see where I've listed the title. This is from 2012, so it's actually about 10 years old, getting a little bit old. Rebecca Leydon, I'm not sure if it's Leydon or Leydon, I think it's Leydon, is a professor at Oberlin. She, you can see her page here. That's what she looks like. She teaches music theory. She did her PhD at McGill in the 90s. And when it says professor of music theory, that means that she's a full professor as opposed to one of the lower levels of rank. My title is assistant professor, and then after you get tenure, you become an associate professor. And then after that, you can go up for promotion again and become a full professor. And so if it says professor of music theory, that's what that means about her. And you can see her publications and her research interests are summarized here. That she is interested in a lot of the stuff we've been talking about this semester. She's interested in narrative. A lot of her publications deal with narrative and topics, musical meaning, like I say, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about this semester. Her main goal in this article is to apply Cornelia Fales' approach to studying timbre in non-Western music to several Western classical examples, notably Black angels. And Cornelia Fales is the first person whose name I listed here. Cornelia Fales is an ethnomusicologist who wrote this article called The Paradox of Timbre and talks about this concept of perceptualization. The idea is that as Westerners, we are really not attuned to timbre. Like, we listen to it, and as she explains in this article, like, we definitely cognize it, we perceive it, and we interpret it, but we don't have good ways of talking about it. And that's a theme that we have discussed in so many articles this semester, that we're just not good at talking about timbre as a people. And so Fales gets into that in her article about like how other cultures use timbre and how timbre is important in music theories of other cultures, of non-Western musics. So Leydon is applying some of those same ideas to Western music and to Black angels in particular. That's partly why she comes in first in my list of key terms and people. I'm going to move back and forth between this list and this list, the key terms and people, and the what I think of as main points of the article. So here's an important point. We manipulate timbre in our minds more than other sensory input, and we do so unconsciously. Quote, timbre is at once the sound of the physical world around us and the sound of our own nervous systems. So we interpret it, and we also respond to it in a physiological way that's actually involuntary, that we don't really control. And it's one of the only kinds of sensory inputs that we don't control, in the same way that, like, we can close our eyes, or we can plug our noses, I guess, or avoid putting something in our mouths. But it's really hard to avoid hearing something once it has begun sounding around you. So I want to look at, just really quick, explaining the difference between efferent pathways and afferent pathways. So and that comes here in 2.2. We're really talking about physiology here, and it's interesting to read an article that really combines meaning and interpretation and narrative and things like that with actual physiology of the ear. So in this paragraph, she kind of explains, hearing is not simply a matter of unilateral sound pressure on the auditory nerve, but rather a cascade of intricate electrochemical events within the body. And I love how much she emphasizes the role of the body in listening and the role of the body in interpretation of what we hear. Intertwined with the neural pathways that transmit sounds from the ear to the brain, called afferent pathways. So afferent pathways take sound in and take sound and transmit that information from the ear to the brain. are parallel routes carrying signals from the opposite direction from the brain back to the ear, known as efferent pathways. So afferent from the ear to the brain, and efferent from the brain back to the ear. And it's like she says, these efferent downlinks interact with the incoming audio signals in complex feedback loops. So the idea is that you hear something and your mind interprets it, and then it tells you what you're hearing as you continue to hear that thing. That's one reason that I wanted to put these on the handout. Most of the key terms and people are musical examples, and I will do my best to link as many of those as I can in the discussion page itself so that you can just easily listen to those for a moment. And they are examples that use spectralism or that use sine waves and different kinds of timbres in interesting ways. Sinusoidal purity, she also talks about in terms of sine waves, is the idea that there are signs that are very pure, like a pure harmonic that happens so far up the harmonics spectrum that all it is sound. Like it's really like divorced from any kind of timbral identity, and it's pure, and when it happens in a piece of music, it often signifies something, and that happens in Black Angels a lot, which by this point I hope that you have also read or watched my other videos and listened to Black Angels. But there are examples of harmonics in crystal glasses and on the strings in Black Angels, and also in bowed tam-tams, and those are examples of sinusoidal purity, and they have a narrative function or a semiotic function in that piece to signify something important. And usually that thing that they signify is some kind of other purity or some kind of divinity, like in God music, or something distinct from the movements that you might just call noise. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so we'll come back to those last two in a second. Goodbye to Lena is a contemporary, I'm not sure if she's still alive, composer, so who gets mentioned at one point in the article. This was interesting to me. Certain sounds trigger either musical or language regions of our brains, but timbre kind of does both. Like we listen for fused timbres that create speech, and this was so cool to listen to these examples. Not that one, but this one where she's like taken out the different kind of sonic layers and isolated them, and they don't make sense. But then if you listen to them again in example 7 and 8, they make total sense. Like you can hear the language in those examples, and that's really neat. So if you haven't done that already, when you're using a Music Theory Online article, make sure you do click through and listen to these examples because they are so neat. So timbre sort of both. We can listen for fused timbres that create speech, or we can separate perceptual layers and hear different frequencies. The same way that you can understand linguistically what someone is saying, and you also might describe their voice in a particular way, like, oh, that person has vocal fry, but that doesn't usually interfere with you understanding the literal words that they're saying. And this is important too. From timbre, we deduce the physical nature of the sound source, and that has been, I didn't really pick this up from her, but she and I think, are aligned in thinking that this is important for analyzing Black Angels, that when you listen to Black Angels, part of the way that you interpret meaning in the piece is by imagining what kind of creature or setting would produce such a sound. So when we listen to the Night of the Electric Insects, we can sort of fathom, because of their timbre, that they are electric insects and not a string quartet imitating insects when we listen to it. So there's kind of a spectrum, a timbral sonic spectrum. At one end is that sinusoidal purity, a pure tone. It lacks any kind of identity. You can't really tell what its sound source is. And at the other end is noise that is like kind of too embodied and not musical enough to be called music. It's too material. And I think that the electric insects are an example of that too. She says we can isolate sound waves to sound pure in this way, and that's part of what she has done by like isolating some of those. And she gives an example of Varese, who was really attracted to all the different sounds that electronic like synthesized music could include, and really wanted to try to achieve that kind of purity. And there she talks about, she gets into this idea of sine waves as a contemplative object, and this via negativa is like a meditative concept, and the idea is that like you eliminate things from your brain as you meditate, and you eliminate distractions, and you can just like concentrate on something pure. And she's suggesting that there are composers for whom, or other people for whom, sine waves can be that way because it's such a pure sound. It's so separate from its fundamental and other timbral sources around it. So I assigned this because of Black Angels, and I wanted to spend a lot of time in the class talking about Black Angels, and I wanted to continue to kind of get into that piece from a variety of perspectives. I'll read this quote to you from 6.1. I contend that listening to timbre as a fusing and fracturing of layers and mapping these transformations onto states of embodiment and disembodiment enables a particularly rich experience of this music. So that's like another kind of later thesis statement toward the last section of the article. She talks a lot about binary oppositions that are present in the movement titles, particularly in Black Angels, like God and the Devil and things like that, and assigns them different meanings as noise versus purity. And you could definitely separate the movements as she does to ones that are like mostly noise or the ones that are have a lot more pure sine waves in them because they have a lot more harmonics, or because they've muted themselves, like in the Sarabanda where they in the Pavana where they are playing in the style of viols and they don't use any vibrato. That's another one where there's purity present in the piece. And I think she makes a good point that there's like a spiritual component to that in terms of its like poetic content, that we can think of the movements in Black Angels as having these different kind of spiritual meanings or other kind of poetic meanings, and timbre is a primary way that we experience that, and we do so in our bodies. Sounds in Black Angels that sound embodied are often kind of scary, like the insects, whereas the disembodied ones might sound a little bit more comforting in some cases, like the God music, because it draws on images that you already probably have of divinity or God or heaven or whatever. So it's interesting, she points out how much ambiguity there is in the piece, which is an argument I have also made, that it's really ambiguous what the point, or not the point, but what the narrative is supposed to be and what the shape of it is, as I have brought up in the other video that I made about Black Angels. And then, yet symmetry is also paradoxically a really important element of Black Angels. And I wanted to just go back to this great example that she includes, pointing out the symmetry of the piece in general and explaining that these movements are related to each other. So you get the threnody happening at the beginning, and then it returns toward the end, etc. The relationship between ambiguity and symmetry seems like an odd one. Like a piece can't be both really ambiguous and really symmetrical, because symmetry is very overt as a structural quality, yet this piece has a lot of ambiguous elements in it. And I love that she points that out. So Black Angels contains a lot of references to other composers and sounds and pieces, and it's very referential. And thinking about timbre is one way that some of those references are conveyed. And so it's helpful to come at it from that perspective. And then at one point in her discussion of devil music, she talks a lot about tritones, because it's not just the tritones, it's the timbres that accompany the tritones. And there's a lot of noise in the devil's movement. So if you think about, like, again, noise corresponding to a sort of embodiment, but that's like a scary embodiment, I think that's a really accurate way of analyzing that movement. I think that corresponds to how I hear that movement as well. You can tell me if you disagree. So I will post some discussion questions in the discussion itself rather than on this handout. And you're welcome to also post your own questions that you might have about the article and about this piece. And I look forward to our discussion. So bye for now.